For 25 years, a 59-year-old man in Shanghai depended on daily insulin injections after his pancreas effectively stopped producing enough of it. Then, doctors used his own blood cells to create functioning pancreatic tissue in a laboratory and transplanted it into his liver. 11 weeks later, he no longer needed insulin. The breakthrough, published in 2024, raises a staggering question. Could medicine finally be approaching a way to reverse type 2 diabetes? A 59-year-old man in Shanghai had been injecting himself with insulin every single day for 25 years. His pancreas had essentially given up. His kidneys had already failed once. By every clinical measure, he was locked into a life of needles, blood sugar monitors, and the slow accumulation of damage that diabetes inflicts on every organ it touches. Then in July 2021, doctors at Shanghai Changjiang Hospital did something that had never been attempted on a human being before. They drew a small sample of his own blood, took the cells inside it, and over the course of several weeks in a laboratory, turned those ordinary blood cells into something they were never supposed to become: functioning pancreatic tissue. Tissue that could sense sugar in the bloodstream and release exactly the right amount of insulin in response, the way a healthy pancreas does automatically, thousands of times a day, without the person ever thinking about it. They transplanted that lab-grown tissue into his liver through a thin catheter threaded into the portal vein. No open surgery, no cutting, just a guided infusion into the organ with the richest blood supply in the body. 11 weeks later, the man stopped needing insulin injections. 11 weeks. After 25 years of daily needles, the requirement vanished in less than 3 months. 1 year after that, he stopped needing oral medication entirely. His blood sugar regulated itself. His body was, for the first time in a quarter of a century, doing the job on its own. When the results were published in the journal Cell Discovery in April 2024, the reaction from the global medical community was a strange mixture of astonishment and disbelief. Not because the idea was new. Scientists had been chasing this exact outcome for decades. The astonishment was that it had actually worked in a real patient, with real, sustained results. And the disbelief came from a question nobody could quite answer yet. If this works, what happens to the 537 million people currently living with type 2 diabetes worldwide, and the trillion-dollar industry built entirely around the assumption that their disease would never go away? If you are the kind of person who loves stories like this, please hit the like button right now. These videos take a serious amount of time and research to put together, and subscribing means you will never miss the next one. There is a lot of ground to cover here. By the end of this video, you will understand what this treatment actually does inside the body, why it took 60 years of failed attempts to get here, and why the answer to one of the biggest health crises on the planet might have been hiding inside your own bloodstream the entire time. The disease that learned to be patient. To understand why this breakthrough matters so much, you first need to understand what type 2 diabetes actually is, because most people have it backwards. The common assumption is that diabetes is a sugar problem. Eat too much sugar, get diabetes. That is like saying a car crash is a speed problem. Speed is involved, but the failure is in the braking system. In type 2 diabetes, the braking system is insulin. Every time you eat, your blood sugar rises. Your pancreas detects that rise and releases insulin, which tells your cells to open up and absorb the glucose. The sugar leaves the blood, enters the cells, and gets used for energy. The system is elegant, automatic, and in a healthy person, completely invisible. In type 2 diabetes, that system breaks down in 2 stages, and the second one is the reason this disease is so difficult to escape. First, the body's cells become resistant to insulin. They stop responding to it efficiently. The pancreas compensates by producing more. This can go on for years, sometimes decades, without obvious symptoms. But the pancreas is not built for overtime. Eventually, the beta cells inside it, the specific cells responsible for manufacturing insulin, begin to burn out. They lose function. Some of them die. When enough beta cells are gone, the pancreas can no longer keep up, and blood sugar begins to rise permanently. This is the stage where most people get diagnosed, and by the time they do, they have already lost a significant portion of their insulin-producing capacity. Some studies estimate that more than 50% of beta cell function is already gone by the time a type 2 diagnosis is made. The damage was happening silently, for years, before anyone measured it. That lost capacity is the reason type 2 diabetes has been treated as a one-way door. You can manage the symptoms. You can inject synthetic insulin. You can take drugs that force your remaining beta cells to work harder, or that make your cells slightly more sensitive to the insulin that is still being produced. But none of those treatments restore what was lost. Not one of them rebuilds the factory. They just keep the remaining machinery running for as long as it can hold out. And while those treatments keep blood sugar within a livable range, the disease quietly continues its work. Elevated blood sugar, even when partially controlled, damages blood vessels over time. The small vessels in the eyes deteriorate, leading to diabetic retinopathy, the leading cause of blindness in working-age adults. The filtering units in the kidneys scar and fail. Nerve endings in the feet and hands lose sensation, and patients sometimes do not notice wounds until they become severe enough to require amputation. The damage is slow, progressive, and for more than 30% of type 2 patients who eventually become insulin dependent, essentially inevitable under current treatment. The size of the problem is almost hard to process. More than 537 million adults worldwide have diabetes, and over 90% of those cases are type 2. The global healthcare system spends more than $1 trillion a year treating this single disease. Between 2020 and 2050, economists estimate the total macroeconomic burden of diabetes will reach $10 trillion, and that figure does not include the cost of family members who leave the workforce to provide daily care. The insulin market alone generates roughly $20 to $30 billion in annual revenue, dominated by 3 pharmaceutical companies that have held that position for decades. For the people living with type 2 diabetes, the financial weight is constant. In the United States, the average annual cost of managing the disease runs into thousands of dollars per patient, every single year for life. The entire economic structure of diabetes care is built on a foundational assumption. The disease is permanent. Treatment is lifelong. Patients are customers from the day of diagnosis to the day they die. And for most of modern medical history, that assumption was correct. Until a series of discoveries, separated by decades and connected by a single question, quietly assembled the tools to challenge it. The 60-year puzzle of making cells forget what they are. The idea of replacing damaged insulin-producing cells is not new. It is, in fact, one of the oldest ambitions in diabetes research. In the 1960s, a researcher named Paul Lacy at Washington University in St. Louis figured out how to isolate the clusters of insulin-producing cells inside the pancreas, tiny structures called islets of Langerhans. These clusters are extraordinarily small. They make up less than 2% of the total mass of the pancreas, scattered like tiny islands across a much larger organ dominated by digestive tissue. A healthy human pancreas contains roughly 1 million of them. Each islet is a self-contained miniature organ, with beta cells that produce insulin, alpha cells that produce glucagon, and a network of blood vessels that allows them to sense blood sugar levels and respond within minutes. Lacy proved that if you took those islets from a healthy donor and transplanted them into a diabetic animal, the animal's blood sugar normalized. The concept was proven in the 1960s. Translating it to humans took 40 more years, and the reason for that delay tells you almost everything you need to know about why this field moved so slowly. Islet transplantation in humans ran into 2 enormous problems from the beginning. First, the human immune system treated transplanted islets like an invading infection and destroyed them. Second, there were never enough donors. The islets had to come from deceased organ donors, and extracting them intact from a donated pancreas was an extraordinarily delicate process with a high failure rate. Between 1989 and 1999, roughly 260 islet transplants were attempted worldwide. Fewer than 10% of those patients stayed off insulin for more than a year. Then, in 2000, a surgeon named James Shapiro at the University of Alberta published results that electrified the field. His team had redesigned the entire transplantation protocol from scratch, making 17 changes to the standard procedure. They used islets from multiple donors instead of one. They eliminated steroids from the anti-rejection drug combination because steroids are toxic to the very beta cells you are trying to keep alive. The result, which became known worldwide as the Edmonton protocol, was staggering. All 7 patients in the initial trial stopped needing insulin. For the first time, islet transplantation worked reliably in humans. Shapiro's phone did not stop ringing. Thousands of letters arrived from desperate patients and their families, many of them handwritten, asking how they could get on the transplant list. The hospital switchboard in Edmonton was overwhelmed for days. For a brief window, the entire diabetes research community believed the finish line was in sight. But the Edmonton protocol, for all its brilliance, carried a fundamental limitation that time would expose. The transplanted islets still came from deceased donors. The supply was nowhere close to meeting the demand. And even when the transplant worked, the patients needed to take powerful immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of their lives to stop their immune systems from destroying the foreign cells. Those drugs carried their own serious risks, including vulnerability to infections and certain cancers. Over time, many of the transplanted islets gradually lost function anyway. Within 5 years, the majority of patients in follow-up studies were back on at least some insulin. The proof of concept was there. The path to a scalable cure was not. What the field needed was a source of insulin-producing cells that did not depend on deceased donors at all, and a way to make those cells invisible to the immune system so the patient would not need a lifetime of immunosuppression. That combination seemed so far off in 2000 that most researchers treated it as a problem for the next generation. Then, in 2006, a scientist in Kyoto made a discovery that would eventually put both pieces within reach: the 4 genes that rewound the clock. Shinya Yamanaka was not working on diabetes. He was working on a question that most biologists at the time considered largely settled. Once a cell in your body has become a skin cell, or a blood cell, or a fat cell, can it ever go back to being a blank slate, a cell capable of becoming anything? The scientific consensus for most of the 20th century was no. Differentiation was a one-way street. Cells matured, specialized, and stayed that way. Yamanaka challenged that assumption with an experiment that was almost absurdly simple in concept. He started with 24 genes known to be active in embryonic stem cells and inserted all of them into ordinary mouse skin cells. Some cells changed. He then spent months narrowing down which genes actually mattered, removing them one by one, repeating the experiment each time. The final recipe was shockingly short, just 4 genes. Insert those 4 into a specialized cell and it lost its identity. It swelled, its nucleus grew, and it reverted to something that looked and behaved like an embryonic stem cell, a cell with the theoretical capacity to become any tissue in the human body. He called them induced pluripotent stem cells, and the discovery won him the Nobel Prize in 2012. The implications for diabetes were enormous. If you could take a patient's own cells and reprogram them into stem cells, and then coax those stem cells to develop into insulin-producing islet cells, you would solve the donor shortage permanently. Better still, because the cells came from the patient's own body, the immune system might not attack them. No donor, no rejection, no lifelong immunosuppression. The logic was simple. The execution was anything but. Turning a stem cell into a functioning beta cell required guiding it through a precise sequence of chemical signals that mimicked the natural development process of a human pancreas. One wrong signal at the wrong time, and you got a cell that looked right under a microscope, but could not actually sense glucose or produce insulin in response. Worse, undifferentiated stem cells that remained in the transplant could potentially form tumors. A previous case where a poorly differentiated stem cell product was injected into a patient resulted in a malignant growth. The stakes of getting the differentiation wrong were not theoretical. They were dangerous. This is where the two Chinese teams that changed everything enter the story, and they attacked the problem from two completely different angles. Two teams, two paths, one destination. The first breakthrough came from Shanghai Changjiang Hospital. A team led by researcher Yin Hao took blood cells from the 59-year-old patient and used an established technique to reprogram them into induced pluripotent stem cells, the kind Yamanaka had pioneered. From there, they guided those stem cells through a carefully controlled differentiation process that essentially replayed the biological development of a human pancreas in a laboratory dish. Step by step, by chemical signal, they pushed the cells to specialize, first into endoderm cells, then into pancreatic progenitors, and finally into what they called islets, engineered islet tissue containing functional beta cells that could sense glucose in their environment and release insulin in response. The team tested those islets extensively before transplanting them, verifying that they produced insulin at rates comparable to healthy human islets, and that no undifferentiated cells remained that could potentially form tumors. The team transplanted roughly 1.2 million islet equivalents into the patient's liver via a standard catheter procedure. The same delivery route used in traditional islet transplants since the Edmonton protocol. That detail matters. They did not need to invent a new surgical technique. They used the existing infrastructure and replaced only the source of the cells. There was one significant caveat that the global reaction to this case sometimes glosses over. This particular patient was already taking immunosuppressive drugs because of his earlier kidney transplant, which meant the researchers were not testing the transplanted cells under the conditions that would matter most for a typical patient who had never received a transplant. The medication was already suppressing his immune system, making it difficult to determine how effectively the body would recognize and attack the transplanted cells on its own. That distinction is critical because one of the biggest challenges with this type of treatment is not simply getting the cells to function, but getting them to survive inside the patient without requiring lifelong immune-suppressing medication. In this case, the team could demonstrate important biological activity, but they could not fully answer the harder question of whether the cells could remain functional when the immune system was operating normally. The immune question therefore remained open, and it is one that future trials will have to address much more directly. The second breakthrough, published 5 months later in the journal Cell, addressed that question more directly. A team led by Deng Honghui at Peking University treated a 25-year-old woman with type 1 diabetes, a related but distinct condition where the immune system actively destroys beta cells. Deng's team used a different starting point. Instead of blood cells, they took fat cells from the patient's abdomen, a routine extraction familiar to any cosmetic surgery clinic. Then they did something Yamanaka never did. Instead of inserting genes using a virus, which carries its own safety concerns because viral delivery can disrupt the cell's existing DNA in unpredictable ways, they used a cocktail of small chemical molecules to reprogram the fat cells back into a pluripotent state. No viral vectors, no genetic modification at all, just a carefully designed sequence of chemicals that coaxed the cells to forget what they had become. Deng had spent over a decade developing this chemical approach, refining the cocktail through hundreds of iterations, testing which combinations could reliably push adult cells back to their blank slate state without the risks that come with permanently altering their genetic code. From those chemically reprogrammed stem cells, they grew functional islet clusters and transplanted them, not into the liver, but beneath the abdominal muscle wall. Within 75 days, the woman was producing her own insulin. 1 year later, she remained completely insulin independent. Deng was awarded the 2024 Future Science Prize for this work, and his method of chemical reprogramming is now being described as a potential universal technology for preparing therapeutic cells of almost any type. What neither case has proven yet, and why that matters. Here is the part of this story that separates serious understanding from headline-level excitement, and it is important to get right. Both of these results come from individual patients, one patient each. The Shanghai case has now been followed for more than 4 years, and the results have held. The Beijing case has been followed for over a year with stable insulin independence. Those are genuinely remarkable outcomes. They are also not the same thing as a proven, scalable treatment. The Shanghai patient was already immunosuppressed. The Beijing team implanted cells under the muscle wall, partly to avoid the liver's dense immune environment, and the patient is being monitored closely for any sign of immune rejection or cell loss. Whether these results hold up across 10 years, whether they work in 100 patients as reliably as they worked in one, and whether the manufacturing process can produce lab-grown islets at the quality and scale needed for widespread clinical use, those are open questions that clinical trials over the next several years will answer. The manufacturing challenge alone is substantial. Growing a patient-specific batch of islet cells from a blood draw or a fat sample takes weeks of highly controlled laboratory work. Each batch has to be tested for safety before transplantation. A previous attempt at stem cell transplantation produced a malignant tumor because the cells were insufficiently differentiated. Scaling that process to serve even a fraction of the 537 million people with diabetes worldwide is a problem of industrial biology that nobody has solved yet. And the immune system question runs deeper than most coverage acknowledges. In type 1 diabetes, the immune system destroyed the original beta cells on purpose. Giving a patient new ones, even ones grown from their own tissue, does not necessarily stop the autoimmune process that killed the originals. The new cells could face the same attack. Deng himself has publicly stated that this is not yet a cure and that substantial additional research is required. Vertex Pharmaceuticals, an American company, is running the most advanced clinical trial in the Western world using stem cell-derived islets for type 1 diabetes. Their therapy, called Zamislacel, has shown that 10 out of 12 patients in a phase 1-2 trial achieved insulin independence after a single infusion. All 12 patients showed restored insulin production and hit recommended blood sugar control targets. The company is now in a phase 3 pivotal trial enrolling 50 patients and has accelerated its FDA submission timeline from 2030 to 2026. But those patients still require chronic immunosuppressive drugs to keep their immune systems from destroying the transplanted cells. And the company's attempt to solve that problem with an encapsulation device, a physical shell designed to hide the cells from immune detection while still allowing insulin to pass through, did not produce enough insulin in trials and has been discontinued. The race to make this work without lifelong immunosuppression is now the central unsolved problem of the entire field. It is the difference between a treatment for a small number of severe cases and a cure available to hundreds of millions. And whoever solves it will have something that goes far beyond a medical breakthrough. They will have an answer to a disease that costs the global economy trillions, destroys organs, shortens lives, and currently has no endpoint other than management. Why this time is different? Set aside the hype for a moment. Look at what actually changed. For 60 years, the dream of replacing destroyed insulin-producing cells ran into two walls. Not enough donor cells, and the immune system kills what you transplant. The Chinese teams did not just push against those walls, they removed the first one entirely. The donor shortage is, in principle, solved. Any patient's own cells can become the source material. The manufacturing needs to scale, but the biology works. The second wall, immune rejection, is cracked but not broken. Deng's chemical reprogramming approach, using the patient's own tissue without genetic modification, is the closest anyone has come to a transplant the immune system might tolerate long-term. The data so far supports that. Whether it holds across hundreds of patients and many years is exactly what the next wave of trials will determine. What makes this moment different from every previous false dawn in diabetes research is that these are not animal results. They are not theoretical models. They are human patients living without insulin, with functioning lab-grown tissue inside their bodies, confirmed by peer-reviewed data in two of the most respected journals in cell biology. That has never happened before. Not once in the entire history of diabetes medicine. The trillion-dollar question sitting underneath all of this is not really a scientific one. It is an economic one. The global diabetes treatment industry generates extraordinary revenue precisely because the disease never ends. 3 companies, Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, and Sanofi, dominate the global insulin market, which produces roughly $20 to $30 billion in annual revenue. Those companies have invested billions in manufacturing facilities designed to produce insulin at scale for a patient population that, under the current treatment model, only grows. China alone has approximately 140 million people living with diabetes, more than any other country on the planet, roughly 1 in 4 of all diabetes patients worldwide. If a one-time cell transplant could replace daily insulin injections for even a meaningful fraction of those patients, the financial impact would ripple through pharmaceutical companies, insurance systems, and government health budgets in ways that are difficult to fully calculate. The science to make that possible was not developed overnight. It was assembled across 6 decades, 3 continents, and a chain of discoveries that most people never heard about while they were happening. It started with frog eggs in a British laboratory in 1962, when John Gurdon proved that cell specialization could be reversed. It moved through Paul Lacy's islet isolation work in St. Louis. It stumbled through 2 decades of failed transplants that left fewer than 10% of patients insulin-free. It broke open with the Edmonton protocol in 2000 and gained entirely new tools when Yamanaka showed that 4 genes could rewind a skin cell to its embryonic potential. And it finally reached the point where 2 teams in China could take a patient's own cells, grow functioning pancreatic tissue in a laboratory, and put it back inside the body where it works. Every one of those steps looked like a dead end at some point. Every one of them turned out to be essential. The full answer to type 2 diabetes may not arrive next year. It may not arrive in 5 years. But after 60 years of incremental progress, dead ends, and partial solutions, something fundamental has shifted. For the first time in the history of this disease, the question has changed. It is no longer whether the human body can be taught to regulate its own blood sugar again after losing that ability. That has now been demonstrated. The question is how fast the world can scale what has already been proven to work in the patients who proved it first. Want to keep learning with us? Subscribe and don't miss the next episode.